this briefing on evaluating state tax incentives. My name is Mandy Rafel, and I'm a program principal in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the National Conference of State Legislatures. I will be serving as the moderator of today's webinar, Evaluating Tax Incentives Using Evidence to Inform Policy. As a reminder, if at any time during this webinar you have any difficulty hearing the audio through your computer system, please use your telephone to dial in to hear the audio portion. Next slide, please. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Pew Charitable Trust to bring this webinar to you. In case you are not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and staffs of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths, and territories. NCSL provides research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. NCSL conducts a variety of research related to state tax policy, which we make available on our website. In addition, tax incentive issues are within the jurisdiction of two NCSL standing committees, the Committee on Budgets and Revenue and the Labor and Economic Development Committee. NCSL standing committees allow legislators and legislative staff to exchange state experiences in shaping public policy and managing the legislative institution. They meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit and the NCSL Fall Forum. For more information on these meetings or NCSL's activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. The purpose of this jointly sponsored webinar is to examine state efforts to evaluate tax incentives and to explore effective approaches to developing meaningful goals and metrics. It features 3 presentations. The first presentation will highlight research conducted by the Pew Charitable Trust on evaluating tax incentives. This discussion will be followed by presentations from policymakers in 2 states, Oregon and Rhode Island, who will share some activities taking place in their states. After we hear from our panelists, we will open up the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask questions, you can simply type a question in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. Your question will not be visible to everyone, only to the webinar administrators. We will take as many questions as possible within the time we have available. Next slide, please. Our first speaker, Josh Goodman, is an expert on economic development tax incentives with Pew's State Fiscal Health and Economic Growth Project. Josh has served as lead writer for Pew's first 2 research reports on tax incentives, evidence counts, and avoiding blank checks. Since joining the tax incentives team full-time earlier this year, he has provided technical assistance to lawmakers proposing evaluation laws and to state analysts studying tax incentives. Next slide, please. Our second presenter is Representative Vicki Berger from Oregon. Representative Berger is a lifelong resident of her district in Salem, where much of her community service has revolved around supporting public education. Since her election to the House in 2002, Representative Berger has been an advocate for many issues, including creating economic incentives to promote and recruit businesses. She currently serves as the co-vice chair for the Oregon House Committee on Tax Credits. Next slide, please. Our third and final speaker will be Senator Dan DuPont from Rhode Island. Senator DuPont has served in the legislature for nearly 15 years after being elected in November of 1998 and sworn in as the youngest state senator. He is a lifelong resident of East Providence and remains very active in his local community. He works as a financial advisor and currently serves as chair of the Senate Finance Committee. We look forward to hearing from all 3 of our distinguished speakers. At this time, I will turn the program over to Josh Goodman. Welcome, Josh.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Mandy, and thank you all for being with us this afternoon. As Mandy said, my name is Josh Goodman, and I'm a senior researcher with the Pew Charitable Trust State Economic Development Tax Incentives Project. And I'm going to just speak briefly to set the stage for our 2 speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them. First, to get everyone on the same page, we always like to start our presentations by explaining what we mean by economic development tax incentives. So you can see our definition there up on your screen. Tax incentives are exceptions to regular tax rules meant to achieve an economic goal by encouraging people or businesses to do something they otherwise would not have done. And that something is often to locate or invest within your state or to create or retain jobs. So economic development tax incentives are just part of the broader universe of tax credits, exemptions, or deductions that are collectively known as tax expenditures or tax preferences. Now, that being said, while our work focuses specifically on economic development tax incentives, different states have defined what they care about in different ways. So as you'll hear, Rhode Island's new evaluation law focuses specifically on economic development tax incentives, while Oregon's review process covers virtually all tax credits, not just ones for economic development. Washington State actually has a schedule that covers more than 600 tax preferences, so basically the entire universe of tax expenditures that's out there. So whether your state is focused on reviewing economic development tax incentives specifically or tax expenditures generally, hopefully there will be relevant lessons for you. The reason we at Pew care about economic development tax incentives is probably the same reason you do too. Tax incentives are important policy choices for both state budgets and their economies. When policymakers want to spur businesses to create jobs and make new investments, tax incentives are often the primary tool they use. So states also use grants or loans or other kinds of direct assistance, but tax incentives are really, in many states, the primary tool. States spend billions of dollars a year on tax incentives, and they don't want to miss opportunities to spark economic growth that will lead to more jobs, higher earnings, and brighter prospects for the people they serve. At the same time, tax incentives come with important budget implications. A dollar spent on a tax incentive is one that can't be spent on other investments such as education and infrastructure. Despite their importance, however, tax incentives frequently receive little scrutiny from state lawmakers. And the basic reason why is that tax incentives don't work like direct spending that takes place through state budgets. Everyone, I'm sure, is very familiar with states' budget processes on the phone. Every year or two, states make decisions about spending. And no one would claim that these processes are perfect. Sometimes decisions are based on anecdotal information or politics instead of hard evidence. Still, despite the flaws, legislators provide scrutiny and set policy. They decide how much money to commit to each state agency. And the same thing really doesn't happen for tax incentives. Tax incentives usually are not part of these same decisions. Typically, tax incentives are permanent parts of the state tax code. They can continue indefinitely, in theory forever, without being reassessed or reapproved by lawmakers. And so what our speakers are going to talk about is ways to change that to give tax incentives the attention they deserve. And there are really two key steps to doing so. The first is for states to evaluate all their major tax incentives regularly, so as to provide lawmakers with the evidence they need to make decisions. And several states are doing this. They've either charged their legislative or executive branch staff with studying the results of tax incentives. In our report, Evidence Counts, we found that as of 2011, 16 states had taken major steps towards evaluating all their tax incentives. And 9 of those, the 9 you see on the map on your screen, had established a regular schedule to do so. So it wasn't just a one-time review. It was something they were doing regularly. And since 2011, it's been gratifying to see more states join that group, including Florida, Maryland, and, as you'll hear, Rhode Island. Then, in addition to regularly evaluating tax incentives, the second step is to integrate these evaluations into the policymaking process. And by doing that, states can make sure that elected officials review tax incentives and make informed decisions. And as of 2011, 4 states have connected regular evaluations to policymaking: Arizona, Iowa, Oregon, and Washington. Once implemented, Rhode Island's new law would add it to this group. So what you'll hear from Representative Berger is the perspective of a state that has been working to bring tax credits into its budget and policy-making process for a few years now. And so Oregon has made some important progress, but they haven't found the perfect process by any means. The state is still trying to improve. And then from Senator DuPont, you'll hear what motivated Rhode Island to move forward with tax incentive evaluation how the law will bring evaluations into the policy process, and what the state hopes to get out of it. The last thing I want to say before I turn it over to Representative Berger is that we at Pew are really here to help. While researching states' past performance is an important part of our work, what we're most excited about is the opportunity to help states succeed in the future. And that can mean a lot of different things depending on what your state is working on. The types of things we're doing for states include helping to establish regular evaluations, helping to design review schedules for tax expenditures, and helping states to identify metrics and benchmarks for assessing tax incentives. And we work both with lawmakers who are writing legislation as well as with legislative and executive branch staff who are conducting the evaluations. So please don't hesitate to contact us if you have questions or if you're interested in working with us. With that, Representative Berger, you have the floor.
Thank you, Josh. I'm very happy to be here. I would like to give a few moments of background about Oregon's tax system because it weighs in here. We are a single source state in that income taxes are our source of income. We have no sales tax and our property taxes are limited. So tax expenditures through credits and deductions have a profound impact on our budget. Also, withdrawing an existing credit or deduction is considered tax raising. This is a 3/5 vote in our legislature, and that's always a hill. So we went into the 2009 session during the terrible days of the recession, a budget crisis upon us, and we had one high-profile energy tax credit, which was literally a runaway budget train. And so this sort of forced us to take a good look at this tax credit system and come up with a system to change it. And what we decided and what we passed in 2009 was simply we took our Oregon tax credits and we put a sunset on all of them. And the sunsets, we had a book of tax credits. We divided it into thirds and put a 2-year and then a 4-year and then a 6-year sunset. And we started in the 2-year period with this one that was a runaway train. But there was a book of sunsets that we dealt with in the following session. So what we set up was basically a system of sunsets. Every biennium, a third of our credits sunset, unless the legislature affirms that they want to continue them. And it's this 6-year cycle that all of the credits are on that sort of drives these policy decisions. Then we set up the Revenue Committee as a tax credit committee that would act literally as a Ways and Means process for these credit reviews. It would serve as sort of the guiding budgetary process. But we used our other committees also, and let me give you an example. Our controversial business energy tax credit that was such a runaway train, we sent it to the economic, before it sunsetted in 2011, which it would have done, we sent it to our Economic Development Committee to see where and how it aligned with the policy goals of economic development. We had conversation and discussion in the Environment Committee because the purpose of the credit was to encourage energy conservation and renewable energy sources, and these were policy decisions that had created this credit, so we wanted their input on how to control it short of just allowing the sunset and making it go away. So that is sort of our mode for all of the credits. We have credits around agriculture, for instance, that go to the Ag Committee and that kind of a thing. But the guiding piece is that the Revenue Committee would act then as an overall Ways and Means for the credits and called it the Tax Credit Committee. But it's basically the same people as our normal tax committee. The first time we did it in 2011, our budget was in dire straits, and the Ways and Means budget writers simply said to us as a tax credit committee, you have $10 million for all the tax credits that are under review. And by the time we'd done what we thought was really good work and sunsetted those that didn't, or said we're going to allow these to sunset and these we want to continue and these we're going to rack way back, we still had $40 million that we wanted to spend on these tax credits. But the Ways and Means process simply said, well, you go and pick which $10 million you want to spend, because that's all you're going to get. And I can tell you, as a process, it focused attention on policy goals. The underutilized credits just literally got sunsetted out the door. Budget busing credits, particularly these renewable energy credits, were so severely restricted going forward that we really felt that we had a complete grip on this budget buster for the first time since it had started a decade or so before. It was very useful to get focus when you have a budget number. So that's what we did, the first group of tax credits, and then that was in 2011. In 2013, this last session, we had a second round of the same process. Now, we didn't have any budget busters this time, but what we discovered was that just the fact that a credit is going to sunset if we don't do something brought great focus on the policy goals, and we had very good discussions, and the proponents had to come in and justify this credit with real good data. And sometimes that's really hard to find in the tax credit world, but believe me, when someone is using a tax credit and they realize that if they don't come in and make a very good argument before this committee that they're going to lose that credit to a sunset, they come up with really good reasons. And if they don't, or if we have a contrary opinion about their evidence, we can also do something in between. In some cases, we would means test a credit, because while we thought it might be a good idea, it wasn't something that we wanted to give away to high-income filers and that kind of thing. So we had some options when we would review any kind of an individual credit, but they all are under review. So we have been through this process twice, and 2/3 of our tax credits have been through this process. And I can tell you we have severely reduced the number of tax credits that we now have on the books, because if they aren't justified, they're gone. They sunset. The policy goals are then also kept fresh and current, and we're constantly renewing them on a six-year basis. We also found that we will consider new tax credits, but now when we look at tax credits, we set a standard 6-year sunset on them, and they have to have a stated policy goal. They aren't just left to, oh, well, this is a good idea. We have got them in this cycle, and people understand going in, there's going to be serious review. So we're 2/3 way getting through all of our credits, and the outcomes I could summarize this way. One major credit has been severely curtailed. Some would say we killed that credit, but we didn't. We made it work for us in some much better ways. A number of the credits have died in this process, and we have tweaked policy goals. Some costs we've means tested. We've basically, some of them we've kept, but we've tweaked, and we've sent in the process a signal to their proponents that, you know, we're going to be back in 6 years. This discussion will go on again. You better be prepared. And proposals for new credits are really looked at as a tax expenditure and not just in their policy goals. And that's been the really refreshing thing. We, of course, would like to expand it beyond just our Oregon-only tax credits. We're looking at this in terms of property tax credits. But our ties to federal tax policy is the more difficult nut to kind of crack. So we're doing a very good job working on our own internal credit system and looking forward to using this process possibly to review other expenditures in our books. So that's it in a nutshell.
Senator DuPont, you're up.
Hi, thank you very much. I just want to thank NCSL and Pew for hosting today's event. It's probably helpful just to put in the context of kind of where we are and how we arrived here. We in Rhode Island seem to be the first state in and the last state out of the economic recessions that we've had in the past. And so since January of 2009, we've really been all consumed with trying to get our budget deficits under control. This particular legislation, I would call, is really the capstone to a lot of other initiatives that have taken place in the past to try to get our arms around some of the tax expenditures. I think after 2009, when we had massive budget deficits, when I became finance chair, and we had a 20% of our budget deficit to deal with, and obviously all of the interest groups, from those very liberal, talking about the need to increase taxes across the board, to those very conservative, saying that tax increases would further complicate our economic situation, really caused us to try to implement some components of analyzing what works and what doesn't. We created, for example, within the Department of Revenue, the Office of Revenue Analysis, to try to evaluate different programs, different proposals, really, that were also brought up and proposed during the legislative session. But I think why we've arrived at this point is we've had a variety of economic development initiatives, even pre the 2008-2009 economic decline. The one that always comes to mind, because we've had academic opinions that are completely opposite one another, is the film tax credit that we have here in Rhode Island. We have our director of the Office of Revenue Analysis, who has a PhD in economics, and he is of the opinion that the results of this film tax credit, for example, have not been what they have intended it to be. On the other side, we have a former dean of our College of Business, Dr. Mazie, who did a very detailed report as to the positive impact of the film tax credits, and was able to document to some extent some of the multiplier effects in order to have us measure whether or not it's effective or not. I think what this legislation requires us to do is to do a more thorough analysis, and also I think the ancillary goal is to have the administration, who is charged with doing these analyses, to also provide some suggestions as to how we can possibly improve some of the tax incentive programs in order to better analyze the data. I think we've tried a variety of different, as I mentioned, economic development incentives, i.e. through tax credits, and it's really been a result of us really chasing our tail in a lot of cases. As I said earlier, where we've been the first in and last out of economic recessions, and we've tried to act quickly to try to turn things around. And some of these incentives and initiatives, unfortunately, have not panned out the way they were intended to. I'm sure for those that have read up on Rhode Island, we had a loan guarantee program, for example. Now, while it was not a tax credit per se, it was a program that had always been in existence but was expanded to provide some liquidity and some loan guarantees to small businesses after the 2008-2009 crisis began. And the Economic Development Corporation, which is our economic development arm of state government, was responsible for managing that program and also managing those loans. And what happened was they made one significantly large loan to one company by a former Red Sox baseball player, and it failed. And the unfortunate reality has been this anti-sentiment to some of these programs. But I think what this legislation will enable us to do is to really look at not just new proposals that have existed, that will come and be proposed, but also those that have existed for a while, to see if, in fact, we're getting the biggest bang and the best return on every tax dollar or tax expenditure that the state has made. And just to also add to that, one of the other initiatives of the Office of Revenue Analysis has also been to publish, prior to this legislation, a tax expenditure report on an annual basis. And there are some schools of thought that believe that we probably should reevaluate our entire tax incentive program, and as opposed to trying to pick winners and losers, to try to look at an overall comprehensive reform that simply just improves the overall climate in Rhode Island for businesses to grow in, for those that are here, and also move to for those that may be interested in expanding, as opposed to trying to pick or incentivize certain sectors by way of tax incentives or tax expenditures. So this is certainly going to continue to be a work in progress. We just passed this legislation in this most recent legislative session, so the results of it are not yet obviously in, because it is still very early. But my hope is that this will at least give us some of the results that, quite frankly, we've been looking for a while, but never really figured out the best way to get data that is as accurate as it possibly can be in order for us to make a sound, objective judgment as to whether or not some of these should continue or not. The other important component to this is that we have really neglected investing in our information technology infrastructure in the state government for some time. But 2 legislative sessions ago, we appropriated a 5-year, $5 million per year, so a $25 million information technology upgrade to our Division of Taxation and also Revenue Analysis. So the new system, once it's fully online, should enable us to, from a revenue perspective anyway, to analyze in much greater detail exactly where revenues come from, and also, by way of this legislation, be able to cross-reference what revenues may come as a result of some of the initiatives and tax incentives that we have in our general laws. So that's, in a nutshell, what we've experienced. What we hope to realize after this legislation is fully implemented and up and running, and we'd be happy to answer any questions or share any other thoughts with the participants.
Thank you all for your presentations. Now that we've heard from all our presenters, we are happy to take questions. Again, to ask a question, please type your question in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. And as we are waiting for your questions, I just want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. Okay, it looks like we have a question that's probably best suited for Josh. Can you address the issue of how states are making sure that they have all the data they need to conduct good evaluations?
Sure, yeah, definitely, and that's something that, you know, a lot of different states are grappling with is, okay, we have a law that says we're going to conduct evaluations. Now, when the rubber hits the road, how are we going to go about doing it? And there are a few different approaches for doing so. One thing states have done is, sort of as part of an incentive, required the companies that are benefiting from the incentive to report information. So a good example of that was in Massachusetts with their film tax credit. In Massachusetts, part of the reporting requirement for the film tax credit is that companies have to sort of submit a budget for the state that distinguishes between money that they're going to spend in Massachusetts and money outside of Massachusetts, or money that's spent on, say, contractors in Massachusetts as opposed to actors and directors and people like that who probably don't live in Massachusetts, probably aren't going to spend their salary in Massachusetts. And so that really makes it possible for them to measure the economic impact of the incentives is when you know sort of in more detail the budget of the project. Besides getting the businesses to report it, states have a lot of data to begin with, and a lot of times it's just sort of getting it in the hands of the right people. So for example, there was an evaluation in North Carolina where what they did, they hired consultants to evaluate the state's tax incentives, and they gave them access to employment records and tax data that would normally be confidential, but just sort of in this context of this evaluation, they were allowed to access it, and it really allowed them to do a much more robust evaluation than they otherwise would have. And maybe just my last thought is, often it's important for different state agencies to work together. That the Department of Revenue will have the tax data, economic development will be the experts on the particular incentive programs, and so just finding ways to get them talking can really help a lot.
Thank you, Josh. Okay, here's a question for Representative Berger. Can you please describe the tax credit that was seriously reduced a bit more, and which others have been changed significantly?
The one that was a runaway train was something called the Business Energy Tax Credit. That was its overreaching name, but it was much larger than that, and it had developed in the 90s around our sort of policy goal to both conserve energy as an energy policy piece and to encourage renewable resources in energy. So it had a number of different components. In other words, if you had some a business that would in some way conserve energy and could justify it, you could submit for a tax credit. It was also a saleable credit, so somebody else could buy your credit if you were a nonprofit, for instance, and you did a major renovation that had a whole bunch of energy conservation pieces in it. You could apply, you could literally, you would get a credit and you could sell that to somebody who was a profit-making entity. Where we got completely out of control was one, we were pretty generous in what was a conservation piece. If you had a machine, for instance, that collected bottles and cans efficiently, that was conservation, and you'd get a little credit for it. So there was a host of things. If you had a system of transportation where school kids would get to ride a bus, that was conservation. And if you were a transit district, you'd get this credit and you could sell it. So it was way too generous on that. But where it really got us in trouble was in the renewable energies. We wanted to encourage renewable energy, and somebody discovered that the Columbia Gorge has a heck of a lot of wind, and they started building these enormous wind farms, and we were giving away $10, $20, $30 million at a whack to these energy companies that were building these wind farms. And that's what it just hugely accelerated our budget problem. And the bill came due on all these tax credits just as the economy collapsed. And what we had budgeted as a tax credit that would cost, in the 100 millions was quickly reaching 300 million in this biennium and going to 600-700 million in the out biennia if we continued. So we had to completely dismantle it, and yet a lot of these projects were in process at the time. So we knew you couldn't just stop the credit on a dime and say, oh, it's not going to affect us into the future. So, and the policy goals were still the same. We still want to encourage conservation, and we like renewable energy. Not all the wind farms and not all the windmills were big wind farms. Our local farmers were using wind energy. There's a lot to the energy thing, and that was what really did us in was the success of the renewable portfolio that was built as a result of this credit. There was a second part to this question, and I forget what it was.
I think you got it.
Okay.
This next question, I think, can be addressed to both of our legislators. And the question is, what opposition did you face when attempting to establish the review process, and how did you handle vested interests? And Representative Berger, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. There was immediate resistance that this was too broad, not strategic. It was a device because tax credits were considered a 3/5 vote. If you took away somebody's credit, you were seen as raising their taxes, and it's a 3/5 vote. So by using the sunset as a device, it was considered immediately politically suspect. But as a mechanism, it works very well because those same proponents, if they want it, have to really come in with some good evidence of why they want it. We have a film and video, for instance, tax credit that went under review at the same time. And I can tell you, those folks brought in some really good evidence. We turned it to an auction credit instead of giving it beforehand. We gave it after. They have to prove they have hired this many people in the state of Oregon and gave them this kind of salary before they get the credit. They get the credit afterwards. They buy the credit, and then they don't get it until they have absolutely proved that they did what they said they were going to do. And it gave us a great mechanism for making sure that they would come to the table and talk about how they were going to show evidence of the value of their credit. Others are harder to get to. I will admit it isn't a perfect system. Some credits, we give a credit to doctors who treat in rural areas. Well, what's rural? And do you really want to give a tax credit to the richest man in the community? I mean, it's hard to get at some of these kinds of things. They aren't all clean and simple. But at least people have to come in and justify their credits, and they know they're going to have to come back 6 years later and do it all over again. It doesn't change. The sunset as a device was a very powerful mechanism.
Thank you. Senator DuPont, would you like to address the question of opposition that you faced when establishing the review process and how you handled the vested interests?
We didn't really encounter much opposition because we've had in the past proposals by the current governor and the previous governor to actually, as a mechanism to also address the significant budget deficits, to eliminate some of these credits outright and not really not take into consideration whether or not they were effective, worked, or not. And this happened on the film tax credit on one occasion. And we also, in terms of, at least on the personal income side, prior to our major income tax overhaul, we had 88 different credits and deductions that taxpayers could take advantage of. And when we got to work on the income tax reform, we eliminated 80 of them, and we only kept 8. And we doubled the standard deduction in order to simplify the tax code, the personal income tax code, significantly. I don't think we got resistance on this particular legislation because the previous proposals for us to, for us to eliminate the film tax credit. We also have a historic tax credit program that was set to expire, and in the most recent legislative session, we had a pretty healthy back and forth in terms of whether or not that program should be expanded or if we should simply reauthorize the remaining credits available and gauge how much interest there really was out there to use historic tax credits. So I think the purpose or the message in this legislation was pretty simple to folks on either side of the issue, and it was in essence what I said during my presentation. You know, we've tried a variety of these things, but we really haven't had a concrete, solid, objective mechanism to see if they work or not. And we've had these proposals to wipe them out in the past. We've passed on some of them. We've modified some of them. On the film tax credit and on the historic tax credit, we had caps. So they basically served in a first-come, first-served basis. And if someone wanted to take advantage of the credit, but the allocation was already taken up, then they'd have to wait till the following fiscal year if the program was reauthorized or enhanced. So I think those precursors allowed for or enabled for us to have all the stakeholders at the table and have a positive, healthy dialogue, because we all recognize, regardless of what side of the issue or the credit people have been on, that the data has been nowhere near as clear and concrete as it could be, which is what this bill aims to do.
Great, thank you. I'm going to direct this next question to Pew, but the other presenters are welcome to chime in afterwards if you like. During the evaluations, how will you identify benefits for which an incentive is the actual cause?
That's a great question, and that's really, you know, one of the crucial parts of tax incentive evaluation, that there are lots of states that sort of just report numbers associated with you know, businesses claiming an incentive, but it's something very different to say the incentive led to this behavior, it caused this behavior. And so if you want to really rigorously measure the economic impact of a tax incentive, you need to take into account, is this something that would have happened anyway, or was it caused by the incentive? And so we've seen states take a variety of approaches to sort of measuring cause and effect. Sort of at the very most rigorous level, in theory, you would love to sort of have a control group where you say, okay, these businesses get the incentive, these don't, and we'll see if there's a difference. In practice, that's not how public policy works, so there are different ways to get at it. One, for example, there's an academic literature that states can turn to, and there have been a number of good evaluations that have done that. There was an evaluation in Minnesota, for example, that said, based on academic literature, about 20% of these jobs were created because of the incentive, and the others would have been created anyway, and took that into account. And then there are also ways to sort of compare what was happening before an incentive to what was happening before it was offered to what was happening afterward. As an example, Massachusetts in their film tax credit evaluation, what they say is, okay, the film tax credit didn't cause commercials for local universities or sports teams to be filmed in Massachusetts. We know those were being filmed in Massachusetts before the credit was offered, and it's our assumption that they would have happened anyway, even without the tax credit. So if states think creatively, there are good ways to get at that issue.
Thank you, Josh. Representative Berger or Senator DuPont, do you have anything to add?
I would just, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Senator.
No, I would just say, you know, our Department of Labor and Training, as part of their data gathering process, will send out questionnaires, we'll do surveys to businesses. I think one thing that will be helpful as a follow-up once this is, you know, fully implemented, if there are certain aspects or components that those that are analyzing feel are missing, we've, you know, indicated, and our hope is to follow up in that if we can incorporate additional questions or even different ways to ask questions on the regular surveys that are done to businesses, the more information we get, the better we'll be able to connect cause and effect of certain incentives, and I think that would probably be a helpful measure in determining what impact certain initiatives have had or not had?
For us, this is a very difficult nut to crack for all states, I think, and it's sort of the heart of the matter. And we talk a lot about policy goals around these things. What are we trying to achieve? How do we know if we've achieved it? The other thing that we have done recently in this last session is in Oregon, we have the Department of Revenue that is executive branch function, and they provide deep analysis of what they do, but as a legislature, we depend on our revenue office, and this is staffed by economists who we consider to be independent, and we depend a lot on their analyses because they work only for us, and their only interest is in getting us data around these kinds of questions. And we recently, because of our interest in this tax credit and the data analysis that it takes, we have literally, in this last session, expanded this effort within our own legislative branch office to add an economist to drill down onto these issues, because there's lots of data, but is it independently derived? Is it repeatable? Does it come from industry sources, or is it from a source that has no sort of axe to grind on it? These are questions that are very difficult to get at, and we are helped by having our own legislative function here within our revenue staff that helps us a lot with answering these kinds of questions. But it's never easy, and it's something that's part of the process that will always be there, I think.
Great, thank you. So this next question has to do with clawbacks, and the question is whether or not any of these laws have clawbacks that require the incentives to be audited, and if the businesses don't meet the requirements set up, that they repay the funds. And I'm not sure, Josh, is this something that Pew has looked at?
No, we haven't focused on clawbacks, and one reason we haven't really focused on it in our research is that there's another organization called Good Jobs First that they're an advocacy group, and clawbacks is one of their big issues, and so they already sort of have tons of research on that. So that's one place, if you have questions about who's using clawbacks and how, Good Jobs First is a good place to go.
Okay, great, thank you. And Senator DuPont, does your bill do you have clawbacks built in?
We actually have clawbacks that are built into some of the specific tax incentives that are already on the books. That became a trend quite a few years ago. And I don't recall exactly specifically if the legislation has an overarching clawback provision, but most of the tax incentives that I can think of, and we did one a few years back for the financial services sector, had clawback provisions, and so that's kind of been a norm even way before this legislation was introduced and passed.
Great, thank you. What about Representative Berger? Do you all have some clawback provisions?
In the design of some of these incentives, there are definite clawbacks. The important thing, of course, is what are the requirements for the incentive, and do you meet those requirements, and are they rigorous, and are they auditable? And then if all of these things are met, you shouldn't need a clawback because that's what you depend on this data for. But in some cases, we put in clawbacks. In others, you depend on sort of the court system. Well, you didn't meet these requirements. It varies a little by what your policy goals are, and it's certainly something we are talking about a lot, too, when we talk about new incentives. Well, what if it becomes an important question in these budget times?
Great, thank you. The next question is, besides setting sunset dates, have you used other tools to control tax expenditures, such as annual caps And if so, what types of tax incentives are most likely to have an annual cap?
Yes. We did our film and video, for instance, we put an auction out on annual cap. We recently expanded it, but that's one of the easy ways to control some of these, is to say this is the size of the incentive, and when it's gone, it's gone. We did that with our energy incentives too. That was what we ultimately came to when we started cutting back severely on this energy. What was left was a more auction system where these are the numbers, your eligibilities are met, we will give them until we reach this cap. That is a huge budget controller. Other tax incentives are less, well, let's just say we're trying to control them in other ways too besides caps, and that's means testing and other devices to try and keep them from being the blank check. That I like Josh's graphic about a blank check. I think that we look at these now in terms of their budget impact, not just their policy goals, and that in itself changes the way you visualize or conceptualize what you're doing here with a tax credit device. And certainly caps are a very useful tool and one we're using.
Yes, I mentioned earlier as well, we have an annual cap on our film tax credit. We have a cap as well on the historic tax credit. And in essence, what we did in the last legislative session were to authorize the original historic tax credit program would have ended this year. And so we extended the life of the program, but we only made available the original unused credits. And part of the strategy was to do similar to what was used in Oregon, was to have an auction, and it was really to measure whether or not there was a significant appetite out there to do historic projects, construction projects. And there was an oversubscription of interest by developers, which was a good sign for us, in that we will likely be revisiting the program next year and expanding it based on the interest that was demonstrated when the credits went to auction by our Division of Taxation.
And I'll just say a little bit about sort of the national environment with caps. We've seen, like with the business energy tax credit in Oregon, just lots of incentives around the country where the costs increase very quickly and unexpectedly beyond what lawmakers intended. And caps really are a great tool to sort of prevent that from happening, to give lawmakers certainty when they create an incentive of how much it's going to cost. One interesting model that's out there, most states just sort of apply caps to some incentives and not others, but Iowa, for their economic development agency, several of the tax credits it administers are covered by an aggregate cap. And so, that allows state lawmakers to sort of have an idea of, okay, this is what we're committing to economic development tax incentives. And the interesting thing in Iowa is that they lowered that cap during the recession when their budget was being battered, and then just this year they raised it again. So lawmakers are kind of in a lot more control than they would be normally with tax incentives, and they have that flexibility to adjust how much money the state's committing to economic development in the same way that they do for other kinds of spending.
Thank you, Josh. I think we only have time for 2 more questions, so I'm just going to ask them in the order in which they came in. This one has to do with, how did you decide how frequently to sunset or renew programs? And this would be for both of our legislators.
Speaking for Oregon, 6 years seemed like enough, but I can tell you we had an emergency, so we had one that we sunsetted in 2 years because we knew we had to deal with it, and then we basically, in some sense it was arbitrary that 6 years was as far as we were going to extend sunsets on these credits. But in looking at the credits, there have been credits that we have extended beyond the 6 years. They have to do usually with incentives around financing where you, as the sunset approaches, farm worker housing, for instance, is the kind of thing. As you get close to the sunset, it acts as a brake on any future financing when you've got 2 years out. It takes 5 years for one of these projects to be fully developed. So if you've got a sunset 2 years out, it basically acts as a freeze on that kind of an incentive. So in some cases, we looked and said, well, maybe 6 years is too close of a sunset. It has a negative effect on a policy that we do want to encourage. So we aren't locked into sunsets of 6 years. But as a general rule, we found that to be a good time frame. All of us have been hurt and jerked by the economy lately. Things change very rapidly. We didn't want to go out very far because we wanted to be able to respond and keep a close watch on our policy goals. So it might be arbitrary, but it seems to work.
For us, we've had the challenge of, because our budget swings and our deficits have been all over the place, we've tried to strike a balance between not letting the credits get too far out over their skis to the point where we'll be handcuffed in terms of being able to respond to them. But we've also attempted to strike the balance of also being able to provide some predictability to investors and to budget watchers, and it's become overly sensitive because of the persistent deficits that we've had over the past several years. So I'm not sure there was much of a science, to be frank, behind how we arrived there. We do have an annual budget. We have had a situation where we had a massive pension reform, for example. We had a session, a fall session, which has never happened since I can remember. So I think we, as a General Assembly, we have an understanding that if we need to come into session to respond to something before it spirals too far out of control, we have the ability to do that and to act and respond on a pretty short notice basis.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we've run out of time, so this brings us to the conclusion of this webinar. If you have any questions following this event, please feel free to contact NCSL staff Erica Michael. Her contact information is listed on the screen. And next slide, please. And as a reminder, the full text of the report highlighted today, along with additional resources, is available through the NCSL website. And then the last slide, please. And lastly, please take a moment to share your feedback on this webinar by taking a short survey at the link listed on the screen. And thank you all very much for your interest and participation today. We appreciate your participation.